Hi, we continue today in 1 Samuel 20 as Jonathan speaks to David in intense language of his commitment to him. And although there are some translation issues that we'll look at in detail that make a big difference on the center of the passage that we're looking at today, which is this paragraph here, regardless of the translation issues, what's plain is that Jonathan using the strongest possible language to invoke that Yahweh is with him and David as he makes a commitment to side with David over against his father. And in this context, as we've been seeing since chapter 18, the political and the personal are deeply intertwined here. And as scholars have tried to argue as if it's one way or the other, is Jonathan engaging in practical politics, recognizing that Yahweh has switched from his loyalty to his father Saul to David, and therefore, as is typically the case, survivors of disposed kings have their own lives at risk. And we'll see that later in the beginning of 2 Samuel when David takes over. And it's certainly true in the Roman Empire and in many other imperial contexts. So is Jonathan seeing the handwriting on the wall, so to speak, to borrow a phrase from the book of Daniel, and trying to protect himself? Or is it because of his fierce love for David that he simply chooses David over his father Saul, regardless of the consequences? Or do we have to choose between those two options? Is it not both, that he both intensely loves David and he also sees that his father is not only doesn't have Yahweh's favor, but is losing the favor of the people because he's not a very good king, and that Jonathan's own future is better off with David, whether it's out of love or practical survival? So that's the question we're going to look at. And you can see as we've been looking at the key words, as we looked at last time, the key words involved at the beginning, your father, at the beginning and the end of this question of knowing. And it formed, if not a chiasm, as Falkman suggests in detail, at least a frame around that. And in our paragraph now, it shifts very much. So they no longer talk about your father and no longer the issue of knowledge. But notice that even though Jonathan is doing all the talking, David's name is mentioned over and over and over again, including when he's talking directly to him, which is a strange way to do it, but to emphasize hearing the name David out there so many times, along with Yahweh. And David has nothing to say throughout this entire thing. And he won't speak through the rest of the chapter. As we saw last time, his last words to Jonathan in the entire book are these here at the end of verse 10. Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? Jonathan will answer that question, and it'll be a servant that he sends out. We'll see this down here when he describes the action in the next video we'll look at. But today, it's really this language of invoking Yahweh and making it clear out in the field that Jonathan is absolutely on David's side, which would be seen, of course, as crucial disloyalty to his father, which is what Saul's response will be, as we'll see when that scene unfolds later in the chapter. So let's go back to look at it in detail. Jonathan replied to David, "Come, let us go out in the field." And as I noted last time, that had an ominous sound for people who know the book of Genesis, which the original audience of 1 Samuel 20 almost certainly did not. Or if they know the story in 2 Samuel 14, when Joab hires the woman of Tekoa to try to convince David to not let Absalom stew over the rape of his sister Tamar by his half-brother Amnon, but to deal with it. And he tells a story about two brothers that go out in the field, which certainly sounds like Cain and Abel as well. But probably the audience of 1 Samuel 20 doesn't know either of those stories. And in any event, the reason they're going out in the field is not to plan murder, but for secrecy, to get out of the house where there might be ears. And we certainly know we've seen ears, because as soon as David got to Naioth in Ramah, Saul was told, and now he's gone back to where Jonathan is. So certainly they're closer to Saul, and he must certainly have ears there too. So they've gone out into the field to not listen, to not let Saul's people listen. And it highlights they both went out into the field, continuing the doubling theme as we saw in the last video. And that's highlighting the sense that even though verbs are not doubled as much in this passage as we saw last time, with these no, yes, no, and misses, yet misses, and asked, yet asked, that the issue is that Jonathan and David are doubled as brothers, as sons, as people covenanted to Yahweh, at least from Jonathan's point of view, because we never hear from David, or do we? We'll see implicitly we might, depends on interpreter's point of view. So Jonathan says to David, he begins here, by Yahweh, the God of Israel. And suddenly Yahweh is invoked here 12 times in the chapter, and we see how many times in our immediate paragraph. But by invoking Yahweh as the God of Israel, he's bringing the political into it. It's not just Yahweh, the God of you and me, or your family and my family. It's the God of this incipient nation of Israel. So when I have sounded out my father, or literally spied out, the verb can mean to seek out here, shakar, but in Judges 18:2, it's clearly spy out. Samora notes the grammatical aspect of its emphatic. So not when I have, but I will sound out or spy out my father, which is to say, to determine his absolute intention about killing David or not, which we know he certainly planning to do. But as we saw last video, David thought more than Jonathan did that he would know, that Jonathan would know if his father had done that, had made that decision. So when he finds out about this time tomorrow or on the third day, leaving open the question of how long David will have to wait out in the field to get an answer. And certainly suggesting that if you don't hear by tomorrow, don't worry about it because it might not be until the next day. And now we start to begin to get into translation issues, although this isn't a bad one. As almost always, the New RSV leaves out the behold, Gehenna here, and behold. Rather than the flat, if he is well disposed, if he is good toward David. And this is one of those places where it's odd that he's speaking to him directly in the third person. We've seen the indirect third person when David spoke last time, speaking of himself as your servant. And that's common polite language, whether that's suggesting inferiority or simply humility, depends on the context. But it's very rare to speak in somebody's proper name when you're speaking directly to them. But as I'm suggesting, that's part of the writers of putting David, the name David, in our ears so many times in this paragraph, as you can see, 7 times in this one paragraph. So if he's well disposed toward David, or good toward David, shall I not then send and uncover your ears? Echoing from verse 2 and again in the next verse. So highlighting that direct speech and also perhaps a conspiratorial element of that, of speaking directly into your ears. And as Bodner notes here, at Saul's expense, key allies and information accrue to David in the previous chapters and up through chapter 22. But as we will see, some present allies will become liabilities later on, and it's exactly this liability status that Jonathan seeks to avoid, which is to say, he doesn't want to become a liability to David if Saul turns on him. And so here we have the first of some translation issues. As Rowe notes in a footnote, as you can see down below, let's first look at the New Revised Standard and we'll see his options. So New Revised Standard has, but if my father intends to do you harm, then the Lord or Yahweh do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not disclose it to you and send you away. So in other words, if Saul is intending to do harm, he is taking an oath upon himself that it may even be more done to him if he doesn't tell. But it could be translated in two directions, as Rowe notes. It could be, if it causes good for my father, the evil for you, taking at an object marker as emphatic, which is to say, it would be evil for you if it's good for my father. In other words, if my father is if Saul is well disposed to David, that's probably not good for Jonathan. Or it could go the other way around. If the evil to you causes good to my father, so in other words, if Saul is evil to him, which is to say to Jonathan, that would be good to our father, which makes almost no sense at all. And we'll see how that's true in verse 14, that the Hebrew here is ambiguous as to what is going on exactly in Jonathan's mind and what he's proposing. But we can get the basic sense of it, that he's promising to disclose it to David, to answer the question that David ended the last scene with, well, how will I know which side your father's on if I'm in the field and you're in the house? So again, bringing up shalom as the key element here. May Yahweh be with you as he has been with my father, which, as my note below says, not necessarily a good blessing, given that Yahweh's been very inconsistently with Saul. We've seen a couple of bad spirits, whether from Yahweh or Elohim, and he's gone back and forth. So that's an ambiguous blessing, but perhaps he means it in the way that you would expect he would mean it, that Yahweh was with Saul, and hopefully now Yahweh is with David. He suggests suggesting. And this is in verses 14 and 15 where we really get in a little bit of a problem. And I don't normally show the Hebrew, but I want you to see the Hebrew here, and I've highlighted what's at stake here. The yellow highlighted elements are the lo, which literally means and no or and not. And you see it's 5 times in these 2 verses. But if you change the O vowel point to an U vowel point, it becomes if. And that's what we're seeing here, at least partly in the New Revised Standard, if. So here my note suggests that changing velo to velu, and there's 5 of those, as you can see in these 2 verses. So Lo again considers 3 ways to translate this, and even saying them out loud almost makes no syntactical sense in English at all. So just bear with that, because I was going to bring up from Bible Gateway a whole series of English translations, but they're either similar or they're almost nonsensical. So let's hear what I'm suggesting here. Let's hear these 3. Would that while I am still alive, you may keep the Lord's faith with me, that I not die. Which is to say, if David is keeping Yahweh's faith with him while Jonathan's alive, that will keep Jonathan alive. Or if I am yet alive, thou shalt show me the kindness of Yahweh. But if I should die, something else. In other words, the hesed that David would show would only last while Jonathan was alive. And then a third one. And if I must no longer live, you need not show the Lord's kindness to me, that I may not die. Which I can't make any sense out of that at all. But all of those have the word pointed as velu rather than velo. None of them take seriously that the actual Hebrew text says no 5 times in these verses here. And 2 of those are the never here that we hear in verse 15 in the New Revised Standard. So it's a very difficult thing to translate, whether it's about Jonathan staying alive or David staying alive, or how long the hesed has, as Samora has on the literal of this first one, that the New Revised Standard has shown me the faithful love. He has not to do the kindness of the Lord to. And so it's very confusing, and I don't want to waste any more time confusing you more. But plainly what's at issue here is the connection between what Hesed David has of Yahweh to show Jonathan, also to his house. And the house issue comes up twice, the house of Jonathan and the house of David. But we have to ask what the house of Jonathan can mean as opposed to the house of Saul, which he's obviously a part of, because normally each person would not have their own house in the sense of the family lineage. And the house of David continues to be the house of David right up to the time of Jesus, of course, despite the fact that it's a millennium in between, and there are many other descendants and kings, both before the exile when the monarchy ended, but also family successors that lead to Jesus' father Joseph. But it's not called the house of Joseph, it's called the house of David just the same. So the question of Jonathan's house is a tricky one, and maybe that's just in Jonathan's mind, that he's desperate, that there's something that he can have descendants that would be connected with David, although not to be David's house, even if Saul's house is cut off. So let's look a little more closely here. We have the language of covenant, so never cut off, and the language of covenant, kurit, is the general language of cutting a covenant. So here, where it says in the New Revised Standard, he made a covenant, it's the same verb. So we see the verb for cut off 3 times here. Never cut off your hesed from my house, and we talked about hesed last time, translated faithful love twice here, and it was only in verse 8 elsewhere in 1 Samuel, other than in chapter 14, and it's not in 2 Samuel at all. So never cut off your hesed from my house, even if Yahweh were to cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And again, the if here is a questionable thing, because why would cutting off the enemies of David be a condition that would suggest cutting off the hesed from the house of Jonathan? The only reason to think that is that if the enemies of David mean anybody who's in the house of Saul, since Saul has plainly made David his enemy explicitly, that would include Jonathan. So Jonathan is doing everything he can to say, I'm not an enemy of David. I'm on your side here, and using the strongest possible language to say that. And that's really the essence here, regardless of the translation struggles that I'm struggling to convey. So Jonathan cut a covenant here with the house of David. And notice that David is not said to be part of that here at all. And as excuse me, as Kim notes below, Jonathan is taken aback by David's lack of response. He becomes anxious and quickly makes a statement directly related to David's future, not his. Plainly, he's speculating a little bit to suggest that the anxiety that's not named here. But it's easy to side with Kim and understand that as Jonathan just continues to talk and David doesn't respond, that Jonathan would be anxious on whether he agrees with them or not. And that sets up the ambiguity of verse 17, the last one we're going to look at today. So Jonathan made this covenant, or cut this covenant, with the house of David. And at this point, David, as far as we know, has no children. We know he has Jonathan's sister as his wife, but they don't have children. In fact, they never will have children, but we don't find that out until 2 Samuel chapter 6 with another window scene. But he's anticipating, of course, David's children. And in terms of Jonathan, we'll find out that he does have a son. We'll find that out in 2 Samuel 4, but we never hear that Jonathan has a wife, even though we've obviously heard of David's first wife, Michal, and we're going to hear about Abigail and other wives of David who are just named in a list but never characters in the story, not to mention Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon. So we never hear of Jonathan having a wife. Perhaps that's data for those who think that Jonathan's love for David was a full love and excluded the love of women, except he does have a son, even though we never hear who mothered that son. So for his future descendants to join with the house of the future descendants of David, may Yahweh seek out the enemies of David. It's hard to imagine a more treasonous statement to make. If Saul had heard that statement, he would have known explicitly that Saul is hoping that Yahweh takes care of Saul, Jonathan's own father. And then we see the even deeper challenge. Jonathan made David swear. And it's really a question of, is he having to force him? Is David not willing to do this? We only hear that Jonathan made him. We don't hear that David did it. And the ambiguity here is of the pronouns in the rest of this verse. Again, by his love for him. We see that love is all these different times in here, and we've noted in an earlier video in chapter 18 the ambiguity of the Hebrew word for love in its personal and political aspects. But it's really ambiguous here, for he loved him as he loved his own life. Who loved whom as he loved his own life? Certainly we know that Jonathan loved David as he loved his own life. That's explicit. But we've never heard that David loves anybody. And my own interpretation, it would be odd that if the only time in the entire scripture that it says that David loves somebody is implicit in the narrator's voice here in a text that's ambiguous. I'd like to suggest the ambiguity is perfectly intentional because this is all about both. It's all about this mutuality. Even though David isn't speaking and Jonathan is the one desperately seeking to save his own life in case David decides that Jonathan's existence will be a threat to him once Saul is dispatched and David becomes fully king. But the point is they're together. And when Jonathan and Saul are killed together, David will sing a praise for him in the same terms of love, but he will still not profess his own love. So our story will continue after Jonathan has made this covenant and made David swear, with Jonathan stating the plan by which he'll let David know what his father's choice will be. And we'll go to that one next time. See you then. Bye-bye.